We don't often see the moment a nation loses its balance. It never looks like a collapse or a dramatic shattering. It looks more like a long pause, a hesitation, a quiet uncertainty settling into the spaces where confidence once lived. Post-Brexit Britain is one of those rare moments in history when a country steps out of a long-standing identity before it has fully imagined the next one. And in that pause, something essential is revealed: the true weight of legitimacy, the fragility of institutional integrity, and the quiet power of a collective mindset searching for direction. When the United Kingdom chose to leave the European Union, many believed it would be a clean break, a sovereign pivot, a return to national strength. But nations are not machines that switch from one setting to another. They are living, psychological ecosystems. They require moral clarity, shared purpose, and a sense of what the future demands. Brexit didn't simply redraw Britain's trade relationships. It cracked open questions about who the British are, what holds the country together, and how a new identity can emerge from a moment of profound uncertainty. Welcome to Nations and Notions. Today, we walk through the story of a nation after the break, a United Kingdom navigating economic pressure, political turnover, and the search for a coherent purpose in a world that keeps changing faster than its institutions can adapt. As we step into this journey, we start with a simple observation. When a country is unsure of what it wants to become, every crisis feels heavier, every debate louder, every institution more fragile. Britain, once anchored by a powerful sense of continuity, now finds itself living in the tension between what it remembers and what it has yet to imagine. To understand how the United Kingdom reached this moment, we must go back to the decades when the idea of Europe was less about economics and more about psychology. Britain's relationship with the continent was always complicated, a partnership filled with pragmatism rather than passion, a strategic alignment rather than a full cultural embrace. Even during moments of close cooperation, you could feel the distance, the island identity, the global empire legacy, the belief in exceptionalism. All of it created a subtle gravitational pull away from Europe's political center. Over time, this distance became fertile ground for a deeper feeling that the UK was losing control over its own destiny. And in nations, the perception of power often matters more than the reality. That perceived loss of control fed into questions about legitimacy. Who speaks for Britain? Who defines its future? Which institutions still carry trust? These questions simmered quietly for years, building pressure beneath the surface of ordinary politics. When the Brexit referendum arrived, it became a symbolic moment as much as a political one. It wasn't only about Brussels. It was about sovereignty, fairness, social cohesion, and the sense that globalization was rewriting lives faster than the government could understand them. Many voters weren't choosing a trade framework. They were choosing a psychological reset. But psychological resets rarely go as planned. The years that followed became a test, not only of policy, but of collective mindset. This is where the story of political turnover enters, not as the center of the narrative, but as a symptom of something deeper. From one prime minister to the next, we saw leaders inherit problems bigger than any individual could solve. The rapid transitions weren't just political disruptions. They reflected a nation struggling to reconcile expectations with reality. Each leadership shift signaled a deeper uncertainty about direction. Was Britain trying to become a global free trading powerhouse? A self-reliant nation protecting local communities? A bridge between Europe and the wider world? Or something entirely new? Competing visions pulled at the national psyche, each carrying moral choices and long-term consequences. And as these debates deepened, something else entered the story: the quiet erosion of institutional cohesion. Trust in political parties, trust in parliament, trust in economic forecasting, trust in the very idea that the system could deliver stability. Legitimacy, once taken for granted, became contested terrain. A nation's power is rarely measured by military capability or economic size alone. It's measured by the belief that its institutions can adapt without losing integrity. What Britain faced, and continues to face, is a crisis of clarity. Not a crisis of collapse, but a crisis of purpose. The economy certainly felt the strain: investment uncertainty, trade frictions, workforce turbulence, and the slow unwinding of relationships that once provided predictable momentum. But these are surface indicators of a deeper phenomenon: the psychological cost of stepping into an undefined future. In the long view of history, such moments are not unique. Nations go through identity ruptures. They face turning points where old assumptions no longer work and new ones have not yet solidified. What makes the UK's moment striking is that it arrives after decades of relative stability. The contrast between what was and what is now gives the uncertainty more weight. Yet within this uncertainty lies an underappreciated truth. Resilience often grows in moments of disorientation. When a nation no longer has a default path, it begins to experiment. The UK today is full of such experimentation, even if it doesn't always appear that way. Local governments pushing new models of development, businesses redefining supply chains, universities expanding global partnerships outside the traditional European orbit, cultural sectors expressing new narratives of Britishness, more diverse, more contested, more honest. We also see a subtle shift in political psychology. There is less unquestioned nostalgia and more awareness of structural challenges. There is a growing recognition that national strength cannot be summoned by slogans alone. It requires ethical governance, strategic clarity, and patience. It requires acknowledging that crisis recovery depends on more than policy. It depends on rebuilding the shared mindset that makes collective action possible. This shared mindset is the real battlefield of post-Brexit Britain. In conversations across cities, towns, and regions, we hear echoes of competing futures. Some British citizens feel a loss that they can't easily articulate, not just economic security, but emotional belonging. Others feel an opportunity to reset a system they believe stopped working long before Brexit. And many more live in the complicated space between hope and fatigue, waiting for a vision they can trust again. What's striking is the quiet moral dimension running through all of this. Brexit asked a political question, but it unleashed an ethical one. What kind of responsibility does a nation owe to itself when it chooses independence? Independence without clarity becomes adrift. Independence with clarity becomes direction. And direction requires legitimacy, trust built slowly through consistent action. We watch this unfold in debates about trade, migration, the Union, and Britain's place in global geopolitics. The country is redefining itself at the very moment the world is shifting toward new power centers. This creates another layer of complexity. Britain must navigate relationships with Europe, the United States, the Indo-Pacific, and emerging economies simultaneously, while also addressing internal pressures between its own nations, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The story of the UK after the break is not only a story about identity, it is a story about coherence. Coherence is what makes national purpose more than aspiration. It turns scattered efforts into a strategic trajectory. And it is precisely coherence that Britain is trying to rediscover. We cannot ignore the fact that some parts of the UK feel left behind, not because of Brexit itself, but because decades of uneven development hollowed out trust long before the referendum. When people feel unheard, political psychology shifts. Democratic legitimacy becomes fragile. Governance becomes reactive instead of visionary. And social cohesion becomes conditional, shaped by uncertainty rather than shared progress. Yet nations are not defined solely by their fractures. They are also defined by their capacity to rise from crisis, to rebuild meaning, to rewrite the story they tell themselves. Britain's current chapter is still being written. The search for a new identity is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of transformation. And transformations often begin with discomfort. In conversations with British thinkers, economists, historians, and ordinary citizens, we see a pattern emerging. There is a growing appetite for realism, an understanding that the post-Brexit world will require new compromises, new relationships, and new models of governance. There is a recognition that the global economy is shifting toward complexity, and no nation can navigate it with old assumptions. And there is an awareness that institutional integrity must be rebuilt, not through spectacle, but through steady, credible leadership. This is where subtle similarities with earlier British turning points appear, from post-imperial adjustments to the economic upheavals of the 1970s. Britain has reinvented itself before, often after moments of loss. The difference now is that reinvention requires a psychological reset as much as an economic one. It requires acknowledging the tensions between sovereignty and interdependence, between identity and pragmatism, between aspiration and capability. We walk through London's financial districts, through industrial towns in the Midlands, through coastal communities shaped by shifting trade patterns, and we see the same quiet question: what does Britain want to be? The answer isn't obvious, and that's precisely why this moment matters. Without clarity, a nation risks drifting through crisis. With clarity, it can rise from crisis. This journey toward coherence is not linear. It is full of contradictions, contested visions, and political fatigue. But it is also full of innovation, cultural vitality, and the possibility of a renewed moral center. Nations rarely move forward with unanimous agreement. They move forward when enough of the collective mindset aligns around a shared future. As we step back from this story, we are left with questions that go beyond Britain. What truly holds a nation together when its old anchors come loose? How do moral choices made in one moment ripple across generations? Why do some societies turn uncertainty into resilience, while others get trapped in division? And what does legitimacy mean in a world where information moves faster than institutions can respond? Britain's search for identity after Brexit is not simply a political chapter. It is a meditation on the nature of national purpose, on the delicate balance between independence and interdependence, on the responsibility a society bears to its own future. We watch this story unfold not with judgment, but with curiosity, because in the UK's struggle for direction, we see universal truths about how nations evolve, fracture, and endure. The road ahead is uncertain, but uncertainty is not the end of power. It is often the beginning of reinvention. And in that search for coherence, Britain may discover something deeper than the question of whether it belongs inside or outside a union. It may rediscover the moral foundation that gives any nation its real strength, the ability to adapt without losing itself, the courage to confront uncomfortable truths, and the wisdom to rebuild legitimacy one deliberate step at a time.